talk.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Jonathan, and thank you, Johanna, for co-hosting with Jonathan, and thank you to everybody for coming to this virtual talk. I appreciate you taking the time to do this, especially during this strange time. And when we try to understand what's going on, I think there's different ways that could be done. You could imagine Marxist analyses around inequality and power, feminist analyses around care, embodiment, even post-humanist analyses around technology, something like that, and nature. And I've been wondering what would a childist analysis look like, and what kind of questions and language would be looked at. And one thought is around deep interdependence, the ways in which we're learning how thoroughly we depend on each other and also are independent from each other at the same time. There might be questions around futures and meaning and imagination that we could talk about. Yeah, as Jonathan said, my background is actually in philosophy primarily, so I'm really a theorist, but then when I came to Rutgers, I've been more and more involved in social sciences and other kinds of humanities research around childhood studies. And what I want to do today is try to describe what I mean by this idea of childism, which is always changing for me and for others who are using the concept. But basically, it comes down to an idea about transforming research, transforming social societies. I think of it as like feminism, but for children. It's kind of it can be a radical tool for activism, perhaps. But if you think about the fact that people under 18, which I guess is the UN way of defining children, are a third of the world population, then childism ought to be at least something that is as influential as for example, feminism or something like that. And it ought to at least play a role in how we think about social issues and how we think about our research. So the from in my title, from childhood studies to childism, is not away from, but building on or drawing upon, helping to expand outside the people who think of themselves as necessarily studying children into a larger kind of a world. So I'm going to pull up my slides here, if I can figure that out technically. Oh, I need to share my screen, don't I? Yes, here we go. Let's see. Did that work? Yes? Okay. So the way I define childism is as empowering children by transforming social norms or any kinds of norms. And what I mean by transformation here is that there's a sense in which children suffer a kind of marginalization as children through a kind of historical adultism. So the ways in which perspectives are invisibly dominated by adult discourse or language or action, and the ways in which differences of children and youth are invisibilized or marginalized. And so I think that simply understanding children as agents doesn't necessarily change those underlying assumptions. I think it's a starting point, but the very concept of agency itself can be based on adult ideas about agency or primarily adult-centered conceptions. So I think that there's a need to think about and challenge underlying scholarly norms and social norms themselves, insofar as these tend to be systemically age exclusive, and insofar as they do that across politics and power systems, culture, language, rights, relationships, myths, stories, whatever it might be. I think of childism as analogous to certain kinds of feminism, specifically more third wave kinds of feminism, where the idea is not just to advocate for gender equality, but actually to transform norms around gender so that the terms of equality are defined in a more expansive gender way. I also think of it as analogous to critical race theory, where we're not just looking for color blindness, we're looking for looking at deconstructing whiteness, deconstructing it as a dominant social norm, and expanding racial consciousness in a more diverse and inclusive way. And other kinds of isms as well, as I mentioned there. So childism in particular, I think it's about not just understanding children as agents, although that's important, but not just deconstructing generational age, but on top of all of that, deconstructing adultism and also reconstructing social imaginations. So attempting to respond to children's particular lived experiences of difference. So the way I understand this concept of childism as drawing on childhood studies is in three different kinds of ways. And I think most of you will be very familiar with these ideas. So I will go over these fairly quickly. But the idea of children as being agents with voices or beings instead of becomings is, of course, a very influential idea, both within and outside academics, as well as the idea of children's participation in methods and research outcomes. So childism wants to take this kind of idea, but also place into question how we're using the concept of agency and voice or rights or participation or citizenship, and the kinds of ideas that are taken as, in a certain sense, normative within childhood studies, and think about what do we really mean by those, and are we using those concepts are there hidden adultist assumptions behind how we're using those concepts, I guess. For example, if you think about Bolivian child labor activists, how do they define their agency? Well, it's not probably individualistically or autonomously, it's probably more relationally or communally or interdependently or something like that. There are also concepts of empowered participation coming out of childhood studies. And these, I'm thinking of ideas around politics primarily, for example, children's political rights to participation and their citizenship, their rights to power. And there's been a lot of interesting ideas around child-sized citizenship, child-centered rights, critical citizenship, and so on, and critiques of the adultification of the public space. And there's also ideas from decolonialism or post-colonialism around the deconstruction of adultism in a global sense, perhaps. So I think this is a very helpful set of concepts, but I also want to try and understand how the dynamics of children's unique disempowerment might play also a role in relation to this. So for example, in one area, one interesting area that the concept of childism has been used is in biblical studies, actually, and looking at the ways in which historical and archaeological studies have ignored political childhoods within biblical times and biblical literature, and for different reasons than gender and class has sometimes been ignored. So how would childism take up this desire to unpack children's disempowerment, but in a unique kind of a way? And then there have more recently been some movements in childhood studies around normative critique, a so-called normative turn. I'm thinking of critical childhood studies, the idea that there needs to be a normative turn around age, for example. Practices and social arrangements that are studied have to take into account the real world of children and childhoods. I'm thinking of the idea of generation that Barry Mayhall came up with originally, but other people have developed, which is looking at generation as roughly equivalent to feminist gender or Marxist class. So how does the underdog provide evidence for the working of the social order, for example? I'm very much taken by Hannah Warming's child prism research, where she's looking at how children's experiences can operate as a prism for understanding the disciplines more broadly, and the social sciences and humanities work in a broader sense. And then Erica Berman has come up with a similar concept of the child as method, where children can help to, the positioning of children can help us analyze social political practices. So childism is working along very similar lines to these normative critiques. I think the difference primarily has to do with the way that childism is seeking to actually transform norms as well as critique them, as well as critique their adultism. So it's attempting to expand normative frameworks and ways of thinking about research and the language we use, so that those norms are inclusive of children and adults both in equal measure. I think about Greta Thunberg's activism, where in one way she's exercising a kind of agency, in another way she's critiquing adult-child relations, but in an even broader sense, she's using the lived experiences of children and their particular experiences of the climate emergency to shed light on the climate emergency itself, and to help everybody, adults and children, understand it in a different kind of a light. So the word childism has been used before. I'm using it in a slightly different sense from the way other people have used it. In the 1990s, a literary theorist named Peter Hunt used the word childism to mean inviting adults to read as children, not just children's literature, but adult literature as well. How do children read literature differently than adults? How do they see it differently? He stopped using that by the end of the 1990s, and it hasn't been in use really since then. And the criticism it received, which I think is right, is that it really depends on an essentialized child perspective. How do you understand, what is the child reading? That's obviously very diverse, and you can't really boil it down to one thing or a set of ways of reading. More famously, the psychoanalyst Elizabeth Young-Bruhl has been using this concept of childism since 2009, and most of all in her 2012 book. And she uses the word to mean prejudice against children. So she's using childism in analogy to racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and so on. This is what her career had been about, is forms of prejudice against different kinds of people. So she was applying it finally to children. I think that's interesting, but my problem with it is that it's a deficit-oriented model of children. It understands children as victims of prejudice by adults. So it's really not putting children as agents in the center. And her work was not coming out of childhood studies at all. It was coming out of a more developmental kind of framework, I guess, or a more, well, not developmental, but deficit framework. So the idea of childism that I'm talking about today, I started developing it in 2006, and others have been using it as well since then. I'm developing it, but it's really trying to come up with a more positive, transformative conception of childism, not an analogy to race, to sexism, but an analogy to feminism. The idea is to respond to children as meaning-making agents with diverse lived experiences, as child study scholars generally believe they should be understood. And then taking that a little bit further and trying to reconstruct the adultist norms and imaginations that marginalize children in the first place.